August 13th, 2018. A husband stood in front of television cameras in Frederick, Colorado. He said that his pregnant wife and their 2 young daughters had disappeared. During that interview, Chris Watts had one message. If anyone knew where his family was, he wanted them to come home. But as investigators began examining what had happened in the hours leading up to their disappearance, the story quickly began to change, because this was not simply a missing persons case. It was not just a search for loved ones. Instead, it would become one of the most shocking family murder cases in modern American history. So what happened inside the Watts family home during the early morning hours of that day? And how did a father of 2 young children become the central focus of the investigation? In 2018, the Watts family lived in the town of Frederick, Colorado. Christopher Watts, commonly known as Chris Watts, worked in the oil and gas industry for Anadarko Petroleum. His wife, Shanann Watts, ran a business from home and frequently shared moments from their family life on social media. Together, they were raising 2 young daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, known to family and friends as Cece, age 3. The family lived in a home within a quiet suburban neighborhood, about 30 miles north of Denver. To those who knew them, the Watts family's life appeared much like that of thousands of other middle-class American families at the time. That was the setting in which this story began. In the months leading up to the summer of 2018, the Watts family began facing growing pressures behind the life that others saw from the outside. Investigative records later showed that the family had experienced financial difficulties and was dealing with significant debt. At the same time, Chris Watts was becoming increasingly distant from his wife. During the summer of 2018, Chris began a romantic relationship with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. While Shanann and their 2 daughters spent several weeks in North Carolina visiting family, Chris continued that relationship in Colorado. When Shanann returned home, she noticed changes in her husband's behavior. According to text messages released later, Shanann repeatedly shared with friends that she was concerned about the state of her marriage. Even so, she continued trying to repair the relationship and hoped their family could work through that difficult period. On August 12, 2018, Shanann attended a business trip in Arizona. In the early morning hours of the following day, at approximately 1:48 a.m., she returned to the family home in Frederick, Colorado. It was the last time Shanann Watts was seen alive. According to investigators' findings and Chris Watts' later confession, after Shanann Watts returned home during the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, the couple had a conversation about their troubled marriage. Sometime before leaving for work that morning, Chris strangled Shanann inside the master bedroom of their home in Frederick, Colorado. He then wrapped her body in a bedsheet and carried it downstairs. According to court records, Chris loaded Shanann's body into the company truck he used for work each day. He then left the house and drove to the Survey 319 oil site, a location where he regularly worked. There, Shanann was buried in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste also lost their lives during the hours that followed. Investigators later determined that the girls' bodies had been concealed inside 2 separate oil storage tanks at the work site. On the morning of August 13, 2018, people close to Shanann Watts began noticing that something was wrong. Her close friend, Nicole Atkinson, was unable to reach Shanann for several hours. Shanann also failed to appear for a prenatal appointment that had been scheduled in advance. Calls and text messages continued to go unanswered. Concerned for her friend's safety, Nicole went to the Watts family home in Frederick, Colorado to check on her. There, she noticed that Shanann's vehicle was still in the garage, and several personal belongings appeared to be exactly where they should have been. After being unable to make contact with Shanann, Nicole decided to call police and request a welfare check. Within just a few hours, what initially appeared to be a straightforward missing person case quickly began attracting the attention of investigators. When police conducted a welfare check at the Watts family home in Frederick, Colorado, they quickly noted several unusual findings. Shanann Watts' vehicle was still parked inside the garage. Her cell phone, purse, and several important personal belongings were also found inside the home. To investigators, these were not signs that a pregnant mother had voluntarily left with her 2 young children. In the days that followed, the search expanded to the Survey 319 oil site, where Chris Watts worked. On August 16, 2018, investigators discovered Shanann Watts' body in a shallow grave at the site. The bodies of Bella and Celeste were found nearby, inside separate oil storage tanks. The autopsy later determined that Shanann died from strangulation. Bella and Celeste died from asphyxiation. These findings helped investigators conclude that the case was no longer a missing person investigation, but a homicide investigation. From the very beginning of the investigation, detectives worked to determine what had happened to Shanann Watts and her two daughters. At first, every possibility was considered. Investigators examined the victims' closest relationships, reviewed their activities in the days leading up to their disappearance, and gathered information from family members, friends, and acquaintances. However, as the investigation continued, attention gradually shifted toward Chris Watts. As Shanann's husband and the last known person to be with the family before they disappeared, Chris became one of the first individuals investigators interviewed. During those initial conversations, Chris cooperated with law enforcement and repeatedly stated that he did not know what had happened to his wife and daughters. Even so, investigators noticed that certain details in his account did not fully align with the information they were uncovering. At the same time, detectives continued comparing statements from people connected to the case and worked to build a detailed timeline of events. Each new piece of evidence helped narrow the focus of the investigation. By this point, the case was no longer viewed as a simple missing person investigation. Instead, detectives began concentrating more closely on those who had direct contact with the victims during the final hours before they disappeared. As the investigation continued to narrow, investigators decided to take the next step in evaluating the accuracy of Chris Watts' statements. By August 15, 2018, investigators asked Chris Watts to participate in a formal interview and a polygraph examination. Before the test began, the examiner explained the process and repeatedly asked Chris whether he had any involvement in the disappearance of his wife and two daughters. Chris continued to insist that he did not know what had happened to his family. After the examination was completed, the examiner informed him that the results indicated signs of deception and were not consistent with his statements. For investigators, this was not proof of guilt. However, it was a significant development at a time when many questions still remained unanswered. The interview continued for several more hours. Investigators compared Chris's statements with the evidence they had gathered throughout the investigation. As the pressure increased, Chris began changing certain details of his account. By the end of the interview, investigators determined that they had sufficient grounds to consider Chris Watts the primary suspect in the case. Later that same day, Chris Watts was taken into custody by law enforcement and formally arrested on charges related to the disappearance and deaths of his family members. Following his arrest, the focus of the investigation shifted to determining exactly what had occurred during the final hours before the victims lost their lives. After his arrest, Chris Watts continued to be questioned about what had happened to Shanann Watts and their two daughters. At first, he continued to deny responsibility for the crimes. Chris maintained that he was not responsible for the deaths of the victims and attempted to explain events in a way that differed from what investigators suspected. However, as the interviews continued, his account began to change. In a new version of the story, Chris claimed that Shanann had harmed their two daughters and that he reacted afterward. Investigators continued to compare this statement with the evidence they had collected. Over time, the inconsistencies became increasingly apparent. Eventually, Chris Watts acknowledged that his earlier statements did not fully reflect what had happened. He later admitted his role in the deaths of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. For investigators, the confession represented a significant step toward establishing what had occurred. However, a confession alone was only one part of the legal process. Investigators still needed to build a case supported by sufficient evidence to prove the full scope of the crimes in court. After gathering witness statements and establishing the direction of the investigation, law enforcement agencies continued assembling the physical and digital evidence connected to the case. One of the most significant sources of evidence was the GPS data from the company truck Chris Watts used on August 13, 2018. Records showed that the vehicle traveled to the Survey 319 oil site during a time period that fell within the scope of the investigation. At the same time, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the neighborhood. One video captured Chris's work truck backing into the driveway during the early morning hours on the day of the incident. Those images were compared with other timestamps established during the investigation. Cell phone data was also analyzed to determine communication activity, location information, and the sequence of events during the relevant time period. In addition, forensic specialists collected and examined biological samples, as well as physical evidence recovered during the processing of multiple scenes. When viewed together, the GPS records, surveillance footage, cell phone data, and forensic findings formed a relatively clear timeline of the events surrounding the case. With the investigative file substantially complete, the case moved forward to the court proceedings phase. After months of investigation, the case file was transferred to the Weld County District Attorney's Office for prosecution. Chris Watts faced multiple serious charges, including offenses related to the deaths of Shanann Watts, their daughters, Bella and Celeste, and their unborn child. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts appeared in court and pleaded guilty to the charges against him. Under the plea agreement between the prosecution and the defendant, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. The decision also spared the victim's family from enduring a lengthy trial that would have involved the public presentation of painful testimony and evidence. On November 19, 2018, the Weld County District Court held the sentencing hearing. During the proceedings, several members of Shanann Watts' family spoke about the losses they had suffered as a result of the case. After reviewing the facts of the case and the information contained in the court record, the judge sentenced Chris Watts to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional penalties required under Colorado law. The sentence formally concluded the criminal proceedings against Chris Watts. However, for the victim's family, the impact of the case continued long after the courtroom process had come to an end. For Shanann Watts' family, the case did not just take the life of a daughter. It also took away 2 granddaughters and an unborn child who never had the chance to enter the world. Shanann's parents have repeatedly shared that they were forced to endure a loss that no sentence could ever undo. Other members of the family also had to learn how to live with the absence left behind by Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. For friends and those who knew them, the case was a profound shock and left lasting grief throughout the local community. The case also drew widespread attention across the United States and continues to be discussed years later as one of the most widely known family homicide cases of the 21st century. From those losses, the story has also prompted many people to reflect on the importance of healthy relationships, honest communication, and recognizing warning signs when serious problems begin to emerge within a family. The Chris Watts case did not begin on August 13, 2018. At least, not according to what the investigative record would later reveal. The issues that ultimately led to the tragedy had been developing for months beforehand. Financial pressure, growing distance within the marriage, secrets that were never shared, and conflicts that became more serious over time. Not every troubled marriage ends in violence, but this case illustrates what can happen when serious problems are concealed rather than confronted and addressed. One of the aspects that many people found most difficult to understand was the gap between appearances and reality. To many who knew them, the Watts family appeared to represent a stable and ordinary life. Yet, the events that followed demonstrated that not every struggle is visible from the outside. The case also serves as a reminder that decisions made in a brief moment can create consequences that last a lifetime. For Chris Watts, those decisions resulted in the permanent loss of his freedom. For the victim's family, the absence left behind has remained for years after the court proceedings ended. And for the wider community, the case continues to raise questions about relationships, honesty, and personal responsibility. Many years have passed since the crimes occurred, but what remains is not simply a sentence or an investigative file. It is also a story about the consequences that can arise when serious family problems go unresolved and when poor decisions cross a point from which there is no turning back.